Hello, Jeando.
Hello, Kevin.
Let's talk about something that's in one of Alexander's very first book, his very first book that has been removed. So, in the first edition, he has a section called "The Doctrine of Antagonistic Action on Mechanical Advantage." But then later, it's been removed, and there's no explanation why. So, can you talk a little bit about what does he say in this section, why you think it's been removed, and how does this fit in with your work?
Yes. Well, first of all, I need to give my thanks to the. There is one person that is watching these videos and has made that question specifically in Germany. So here is the answer. What is the early doctrine of antagonistic action and mechanical advantage? And yes, we don't know why it was removed. So many people will have different ideas. The text in itself is really dense, so I'm not so sure I can deal with it in one session. So I'm already preparing, backing my uh, my side. So saying that, well, yes, I'm going to take, first of all, I'm going to show you what is the text, because some people haven't got the first edition, so they haven't seen it. It's in article in Nature by Jean Fischer, so that's easy to find. But I do not really agree with Jean Fischer about he's got views on to why as to why it's been taken out. Um, I must admit that at first it's for most people, and for me it was incomprehensible. So that's why I was so interested in this passage. I've worked on this passage for many years, and so now I have quite a definite view on it, but I'm not going to explain my views on it with this idea that it's the only one, or it's the of course, I've been thinking about it a lot, but it's just a proposition. I want people to understand that this is my personal understanding, but their understanding is as good. They have to just compare, criticize. This is the way we work. You have to be open to exposing your ideas, and they may shock some people, yes, but this is always for good. This is for like having people start to think again about these things that we consider as axioms, as true, as the thing. This is the Alexander technique. This is not. Fine. We can have take a step back, look at it, and wonder why it was taken out. Why this passage was taken out. The doctrines of antagonistic action and mechanical advantage. It's a chapter in itself in the first edition of Man's Supreme Inheritance. It's one page. It's got its title, or 1.5 pages, and it stands alone. It's been taken out later. In the process of creating a coordination, one psychophysical factor provides a position of rigidity by means of which the moving parts are held to the mode in which their function is carried on. This psychophysical factor also constitutes a steady and firm condition which enables the directive agent of the sphere of consciousness to discriminate the action of the kinesthetic and motion agents, which it must maintain without any interference or discontinuity. The whole condition we thus obtain is herein termed antagonistic action, and the attitude of rigidity essential as a factor in the process is called the position of mechanical advantage. Well, can you imagine a new pupil reading any of this? Wow. There are so many words and concepts that are vaguely defined or not defined at all. Well, it's very difficult to make sense of it. That's the first idea why it could have been taken out. then when you study it, you get a second idea, is that, well, there are words that are that would be offensive for most modern Alexander teachers. For most people that are into this wave of somatic interest, all these people interested in relaxation, in release, in being a little bit easier, in feeling good, well, will not look at position of rigidity. It's a term that Alexander is using with kind eyes. It's absolutely clear. Then antagonistic action. Nowadays, this is of course a doctrine, the doctrine of antagonistic action. Antagonistic action has disappeared from the discourse. It's very clear that it has not discourse from Alexander later discourse. I will show you later a workshop he gave in 1949, where he's centering everything on antagonistic action again, and antagonistic pools. So there are antagonistic action, there are antagonistic pools. What are they? What is the link between them? And what is the link between antagonistic action and position of rigidity essential? That's I've been fascinated, to say the truth, with this text. So I'm going to try and show you how we can start to reason out all these parts and make sense of them. That's it. Let's start. So to start with, there is this the very beginning of the sentence already is in itself revelatory, revealing what Alexander had in mind. Yes, he says that we are in the process of creating a coordination. You have somebody come to have lessons. I have somebody is coming to have lesson with me, for example. The person is complaining from breathing or movement problems, and we answer by stating that we are going to work together in order to create a coordination. There are very few people that would define their work as like this. Many times you hear people saying that they want to bring out the natural gesture, the natural movement that people have forgotten through the modern education. In fact, Alexander here is really thinking, is creating a process, conscious guidance and control process, and that process is in fact this idea of whatever the movement the person is going to learn to do. We are interested in creating fundamental coordination of the movements of the different parts of the torso. The last interview we had together, I prepared this explanation of the doctrine of antagonistic action, and I explain what is the main idea in the process of teaching the Alexander technique. It's not to teach sit and stand. It's not to teach people to lean forward, to put the hands on the back of a chair. It's not to teach how to breathe. No, it is not. It is for all these activities, all these different movements, and walking and going upstairs or downstairs or sitting at a desk. The whole idea is to learn to use the conscious mind, the directive agent of the sphere of consciousness, this capacity that we have to reason out orders of movement and to obey these movements in these intentions of movement in practice. And these intentions of movements are not movement to sit or to stand, movement to breathe. No, they are movement to organize the mechanism of the torso so that the neck is free, the head is forward and up, and the back is lengthening and widening. So everything we ask a pupil leads to this possibility, like everything like learning to understand instructions, learning to define movements of parts, learning to think of more than movement of a part at a time, so we can have more than one intentions of movement at a time, thinking of continuity, without, well, Alexander says without interference or discontinuity. It's absolutely obvious that when you are starting to experiment with having more than one intention of movement at a time and performing these intentions of movement in front of a camera, it's obvious that there is interference, and the interference is coming from the self. Is that as soon as you have these different movements in mind and you perform them, you can't escape the fact that you're going to feel something, you feel different, to feel how the movements are unfolding. Yet, the interference comes from the fact that our mind is in fact taken into a habit of focusing on a feeling that is unknown or different or strange, or maybe just a feeling that we are not performing that intention correctly or sufficiently. I have very often some student talking about discontinuity. During the experiment, I ask the person to time the conscious adjustments of the coordination of the movements of the parts of the torso. By that I mean I'm asking the person, as once the person has understood the 3 or 4 intentions of movements of the bony parts of the torso, the person say, yes, I understand these movements. I say, well, you want now, in your own time, to decide when to start adjusting and when to stop adjusting. I ask people to measure the time by just counting. It's a musician trick that Delsart apparently used. It's like saying 1, 2, 3. At 1 I start, at 3 I stop. So when you're filmed, it's very important to say 1, 2, 3 so that we know exactly when you start adjusting and when you stop. And also we see whether you're capable of starting and stopping deliberately. When you are into an experiment of movement, sometimes it's very, you don't feel anything when you are stopping and yet continuing to adjust, because you feel that, oh yes, I could be lengthening a bit more on this, and in fact, from a conscious procedure, we in fact derive into something that is partly subconscious. So there is interference, there is discontinuity, and we must accept it, and it's necessary to train ourselves and construct a coordination to construct the directive agent of the sphere of consciousness. Very often when we start, we discover that we have a tendency to jump from one thing to the other. Mind wandering is the word Alexander is using. But there are people that are producing links all the time. Oh yes, this makes me think of this. Yes, but how is it relevant to the task at hand? How is it relevant to the fact that we want to start and stop at a very definite time in the experiment? Well, it's relevant to it because, in fact, it's discontinuity. We don't want to produce any sort of links. We want to produce links that are really means whereby to, in fact, the process of creating a coordination. So, in the process of creating a coordination, we thereby announce that we don't believe in natural movements. We don't believe in, these hardwired reflexes that should be allowed to work on their own. No, we don't consider that hardwired reflexes of any kind can help construct a general coordination. It's completely impossible to think that automatic movement could deal with poise, could deal with, well, unprecedented events. Something totally new is appearing. Our reflex could deal with that. Our a lengthening reflex, you say, could be dealing with that. When we say in the process of creating a coordination, we consider that every kind of gesture is learned. Sitting is something that children are learning, and they are not learning using their conscious mind. They are using, of course, the somatic cognition. They feel and they adapt to what they feel. The more you have lessons, the more you will discover that when we feel, we tend to feel general things, and this feeling is adjusted to what we normally feel. So if you are asked to perform a new coordination of movements of the parts of the torso that you have never imagined was possible, well, at first you will find that it's like impossible to just obey the orders. You will find every sort of instances where you are in fact not obeying the orders but doing something else, and the video is going to record it. So when we start this analysis, it's important to understand that we are in a special frame of mind. So now there is this idea, the second idea is that in the process of creating a coordination, one psychophysical factor provides a position of rigidity by means of which the moving parts are held to the mode in which their function is carried on. Very, very often when there are difficult sentences, I start by what I know. So I've already started with the start of the sentence. Alexander himself presents the work in a sort of very peculiar way. And also the last part. So he says the moving parts are held to the mode in which their function is carried on. I can make sense of this. At first, one psychological factor provides a position of rigidity. I don't really know what he's talking about. So I cannot really start with this. So I have to start with the moving parts are held to the mode in which their function is carried on. And I started to really investigate what that could mean. Yes. And okay, we have different bony parts. And these bony parts, of course, have to function appropriately. And this is a mode of functioning. But we already know, everybody knows that very often there are problems. There are problems with joints. There are problems with articular surfaces. There are problems with mechanical instability. So, yes, there are tissues in the self that are there to, in fact, provide support to these joints. And so I can relate what Alexander is talking about because we discussed his concept of position of mechanical advantage, and you've got a picture here on the right that is showing Alexander practicing, well, this obtaining this position of mechanical advantage in 1951. So we discussed last week the fact that, well, and we already discussed in there was an episode about position of mechanical advantage where I was using the same images and explaining that, yes, Alexander is defining an example of what is meant by obtaining a position of mechanical advantage. And what he describes here, causing the body, the torso, to gradually incline backward until its weight is taken by the back of the chair. This is exactly what we see here. This is a position of mechanical advantage. So I started to think, okay, how is the student maintaining the orientation of the torso when he's taken so far back, with only a little help on the very top of the neck, and nothing where the real mechanical advantage has to apply. That is, why is it that the torso is not caving in when Alexander is moving the person outwards, backwards, sorry. And so the moving parts of the torso are held to the mode in which their function is carried on. Yes, if the moving parts of the torso are collapsing, of course the functions of support of the neck and head is going to flounder, and also the function of breathing, the function of digestion are going to be affected because the person is going to be collapsed. So I said, well, fine, we understand more or less how the moving parts are held to the mode in which their function is carried on. Or do we? Yes, how is it that the person is maintained lengthening while he's taking out of balance backward? So this is related to Alexander's theme of explaining his lessons. So we have this this idea that there is an inefficiency in simple exercises and in relaxation. I've taken this excerpt from Man's Superior Irritants, where he says that the usual procedure is to instruct the pupil with either sitting or lying on the floor to relax, or to do what he or she understands by relaxing. And the result is invariably collapse. So you instruct a pupil to lie on the floor, to release, and think of some sentences, very curious sentences, and the result is invariably collapse. What is happening when the person is lying down on the floor? Well, what's happening is that the person doesn't need to make any sort of adjustment, any sort of movement. The person is immobile. The person is fixed on the floor by the direction of gravity, and all the necessary adjustments that are requested during, upright functioning, which is sitting at a desk to discuss something or to write, working, standing, walking. All these adjustments are absolutely unwanted, well, unnecessary. You're just lying down, and so the result is invariably collapse, and the collapse is explained. Because for Alexander, real relaxation, if it exists, really means due tensions, and he adds due tensions of the parts of the muscular system intended by nature to be constantly more or less tensed. So I started to make a connection between this text and the doctrine of antagonistic action, because here we have the muscular system intended by nature to be constantly more or less tense. So I started to think, wow, what are the parts of the I will transform muscular system into movement system, because it was very often when Alexander used muscular system, in fact, he's talking about mechanisms of movements. And I said, well, yes, what is protecting the joints? And so when you look at what he's doing, you think, okay, the person has to react to the pull of gravity. When you are inclined backward, the pull of gravity on the different parts is completely different than when you're upright. When you're leaning, of course, the pull of gravity, you're thinking of a pendulum, and the pull of gravity is much more intense at the top of the pendulum than at the bottom, and so with the middle of the pendulum. How do you make the pendulum stay lengthening when you are well, subjected to forces that will tend to bend it? How do you keep the torso extended? So in that case, it may be very difficult to understand what we mean by mechanical advantage. Well, to start with a simple model is better, I think. So that's why I've changed my mind. I said, instead of explaining what are we talking about, I said, well, we are going to take another example. It's the example that Alexander is giving relative to the feet. So Alexander, in the Use of the Self, explained that he wanted to organize more or less the top of his torso and his neck, because he found that when he was vocalizing, he was in fact hurting his larynx. And suddenly he discovers that just dealing with the head and neck is not sufficient. He has to organize the mechanism of the torso movements as well in order to obtain the results he wants. Yet this is not even sufficient. He observed that the incorrect organization of the mechanism of the torso is associated with something happening in his legs, and we will see in his feet. So that's what he says. I observed that this condition of undue muscle tension in the torso affected particularly the use of my legs, feet, and toes, my toes being contracted and bent downwards in such a way that my feet were unduly arched, my weight thrown more on the outside of my feet than it should have been, and my balance interfered with. So I started to think, yes, we all know of these situations where the parts are not held in the position in which the function is carried on. There is a clear function of support at the feet. Yes, it's clear that all the weight of the torso is transmitted to the bone of the legs, to the feet, and of course, in between the legs and the contact of the floor, there is a very complex mechanism of the ankle. So Alexander explained that when he was trying to lengthen, he had an immediate reaction of losing his equilibrium. This was affecting his equilibrium. Yes, it was affecting his balance. So it's very interesting to take the condition of incorrect use in order to understand the process of creating a coordination. So when there is an incorrect use of the parts, for example, the weight is thrown more on the outside of the feet than it should have been, we have a condition where the joint is not, in fact, in the best condition to function. The tissue, intended by nature to be more or less tense all the time, are not really working correctly. And of course you see here that on the outside of the foot there is a collapse. So we will immediately imagine that the tissues that are intended to maintain the ankle on the outside are really going to be strained. But we have to come back to the start. It's because the tissues intended by nature to be constantly tense on the inside are not doing their job that in fact the ankle joint is collapsing on the other side. So we are starting to think, okay, yes, there are tissues that are intended by nature to be more or less tense all the time. And these tissues, we know them. They are ligaments. They are fascias. The ligaments are part of the fascial system. Yeah. And their function is to maintain the joint in the position in which their function is carried on. This is the main idea that I took from there, and I said, well, yes, if you look at the definition, So I've taken the definition by a very well-known article that is called Ligament Injury and Healing. It's by Hauser and Dolan, and it's easy to find on the internet. And the definition is pretty accurate. He says ligaments prevent excessive motion of joints. So it's obvious that joints are working within a range, and outside of this range you get an injury. Outside of this range you get what we call mechanical instability. Mechanical stability of joints is fundamental for proper use. It's fundamental for developing the capacity of movements and poise and equilibrium. Yes? If every time you lengthen the torso, you find out that you have an undue, the weight is unduly directed on the outside of the foot, then of course the coordination of the whole, well, is not correct, is not proper. You're going to try and lengthen, and in fact you're weakening your equilibrium. So this is where we start to think, yes, what are ligaments doing? They are providing passive stabilization and guiding joints also through the normal range of motion under tensile load. So under tensile load means that there are forces acting on the joint. You must understand that nothing of the sort will happen when a person is lying down on the floor. The tensile load that we are talking about at the foot at the moment are absolutely absent from this kind of experiment. Yes, it's necessary to have the whole weight of the torso applied on the ankle, and applied on the ankle such as to obtain a tensile load. On this image, of course, there is an enormous tensile load on the outside of the foot. What I'm pointing to is not the outside where the injury will occur. It's the cause of of this condition. The cause on this condition then is that there is no tensile load applied on the inside of the ankle and foot joint, and so it's because of the lack of action, lack of tensile load. You could say that the ligaments on the inside are totally lax because they are shortened. They are shortened, and every single time the person, I've seen people rest with their feet completely everted, and what it means is that they are used to, in fact, shortening these ligaments. You must understand something is undue use is the problem here. Undue in the sense that not enough. No tensile load will mean that the fascia and the ligaments is going to weaken and develop incorrect bonds, incorrect adhesions, so that the person will not have any confidence on the inside of the foot and will tend to simply go on the outside because that's where it feels nice. That's where it feels supportive, when it's not. The feeling and the reality, the mechanical reality, are completely opposite. So we find that well, yes, Alexander is right. It's necessary to create conditions. And it's very simple to analyze the situation when you start to see that, yes, there are a coordination of movement. There is a coordination of movement that is producing what we call a loose back position or position of mechanical disadvantage of the complex mechanism of support. And of course there are conditions that are providing the stabilization and that are guiding the joints. Some people, they think, why is it that my ankle is always collapsing? Well, they collapse their ankle. And they collapse their ankle in their resting time. They collapse their ankle when they are sitting at their desk. They collapse their ankle when they are standing. And every time their balance is affected, they do react by collapsing the ankle. Most people would think that I am, making this up. In fact, not. In fact, all the students that have lessons with me have been in these conditions where they are, in fact, stimulated. Their habitual sense of equilibrium is stimulated. And immediately, I have them note that their reaction to this stimulation of disequilibrium, unbalance, lead them to, in fact, collapse the foot outside, exactly as Alexander explained he was doing when he was trying to readjust the mechanism that led him to, in fact, injure his larynx. It's quite interesting. So, what we know is explained here. In doing so, ligaments are able to transfer force to and from the skeleton while dynamically distributing the loads applied to them in order to perform specific movement patterns. There are no muscles involved here. We are not discussing muscles to stabilize the joints. The stabilization of joints is not the main function of the muscles. But the main function of the muscle is to help produce the coordination of movements that we want to see and which is going to create the tensile load where it's needed. Not the tensile load where the person wants to feel it. No, the tensile load where it's needed. And it's needed on both sides, of course, obviously. And there are conditions, and in scientific papers you will find it. There are conditions where we know that the joint is perfectly functioning, is within the perfect range of motion. And so this is what scientists call here a closed back position. So Vleming is saying for every joint there is a position called the closed packed or self-locked position, in which there is a maximum congruence of the articular surfaces and maximum tension of the major ligaments. This is the most stable position for the joint. However, it's also the most compressive and therefore primarily suitable for high loading tasks. They're very interesting. I love Vleming's anyway. Every time he writes something, I'm delighted. So, there are different movements that can be applied to the parts in motion. And when these movements are applied, we find that the main ligaments are suddenly highly tense. I know that many modern Alexander teachers have this problem with the word of tension. When they see that suddenly you get maximum tension of the major ligament, they think, oh dear, this must be wrong. Maximum tension, you should release maximum tension. Not with ligaments. Especially if in the case we are talking about of maximum tension around the ankle, especially if the maximum tension of the major ligament is proportionate on both sides of the joint. We will see that in these conditions, this is a condition of movement applied to the different part in motion, and we see that if you apply these rules of movements for the different parts, suddenly the foot is going to start acting as a really powerful catapult, absolutely suitable for high loading tasks. Let's imagine that you are in the plane of improving the capacity of your feet to resist high loading tasks. Let's say you are interested in running. And everybody knows that running creates high loading tasks, and that these high loading tasks, of course, have a tendency to affect the foot, the ankle, and the knees. Yes, it's obvious. And say that you've discovered that your habits of just going from standing to sitting, I've already explained that it involves your equilibrium. And when you are seen on video sitting down, it's quite interesting that what Alexander pointed out as to what was happening to his ankle is seen in most people's ankle. 99% of my students are collapsing the ankle outwards when they are subjected to an equilibrium stimulus. And going from sitting to standing or standing to sitting is a perfect, you don't need more. You don't need a completely frightening experiment. Just going from standing to sitting is sufficient to produce the incorrect coordination of movement of the part that lead to, in fact, the incapacity of the ligament to maintain the proper functioning of the joint and the function of support that is supposed to be incorporated in the equilibrium plane. Yes? So we suddenly discover that, wow, in what Alexander is saying, there is real truth, that we have, well, this is, of course, a dissection. It's not a living person. It's a corpse that has been dissected. But there is a complex joint, and we want this joint to, well, react positively to high tensing loads. And so we are going to start looking at what we call the different ligaments. There is the ATFL, the CFL, all these ligaments that are part of the ankle. So this is only the external part, but you must imagine the same thing. And what the scientists discovered is that they represent a single functional structure. And they say it acts as a ligamentous complex. I was very interested in this because in the modern Alexander technique, in my training, there was this focalization on muscles, on releasing muscles, on lengthening muscles, on pulling on muscles. And suddenly for me, I was in a different world because, of course, you cannot contract these ligamentous complex. You can exert tensile loads, pulls. A tensile load is a load that is going to create a tensile force, and a tensile force, the simple translation is a pull, stretching a fabric. We stretch an elastic fabric. So I said, yes, the moving parts are held to the mode in which their function is carried on by ligaments. What is holding the parts is the ligaments. The muscles are not doing the work of holding the parts together. They should not. They should only do their work, which is to create the movement by which these ligaments can be stretched. The reasoning is quite simple. A ligament will only provide support and maintain a joint if it is stretched. If a ligament is released, you get slack. If you get slack, immediately you get mechanical ankle instability in this case. The same thing is going to happen for the back, by the way. If you injure a ligament of the back, or if you underuse of ligament of the back, which means that you arch the back so that the ligament at the back is shortened, and when it's shortened, becomes slack. When fascia and ligament became slack, they immediately disorganize. They immediately start creating unwanted bonds, adhesions, that are going to make the movements of these different sheets together very difficult. And immediately you get in a situation where you cannot, in fact, trust these parts, which will lead the person to get a habit of not using the ligament of the back. The person will never get the back and the knees forward, and as a result the lengthening between the two is not going to be there. There are going to be less stabilization of the joint, and as there is less stabilization of the joint by the ligaments, the person will have the tendency to compensate by using the muscle for what they are not for. Muscles are not for stabilizing joints. Muscles are for creating movements which will lead to lengthening, which will lead to tension, yes, and these tensions are absolutely necessary for, well, as I said, responding to loads, but also for something else. When we discussed the closed packed or self-locked position earlier by Vleming, yeah, we are discussing, for example, the ankle. When the scientists wanted to create prostheses, they analyzed what the foot, ankle, and leg mechanism was for, and of course, it's highly suited for high loading task, meaning that the toe, foot, ankle mechanism works at its best as a catapult, as a very, very elastic system that is capable of course, sustaining very strong forces of compression and extending the system. So what you see, the blades you see, the prostheses you see on the image are just poor, imitation of the fantastic system of the ankle when it's correctly coordinated. Of course, if you notice that there is a problem in the ankle because some ligaments are lax, you will not run very fast. This is absolutely clear. So I started to think that yes, it's possible to imagine to coordinate movements, and through coordination of movement we come to this idea of position of mechanical advantage. So this is a text, a very important text by Sarafian and his students of what are the different movements that coordinated together with the different parts of the mechanism of the two-foot ankle mechanism create the catapult of the foot. We can as well produce a fantastic catapult or a collapsing foot. The difference between the collapsing foot and the catapult are the coordination of movements of the different part of the toe, foot, ankle mechanism. If you have no idea of how to direct the movements of the different parts of the toe, foot, ankle mechanism, well, there is every chance that you, like Alexander, you'll have a tendency to have too much weight on the outside of the foot. And of course, very, very likely, end is that instead of working as a temporary single mass, it's a very important concept that the toe, foot, ankle mechanism can be made as a single elastic mass, a rigid catapult, yes, then of course you will get exactly the opposite, a lack of support. And if there is a lack of support, everything starts at the ankle, says Alexander in the first book. So here we have it. Yes, they are working with corpses, and they found that if you get an assistant to maintain the plantar skeleton in the posture of maximal supination, these are the movement of rotation I've indicated here. If you can get these movement produced mechanically, immediately all the tendons, major tendons, plantar ligaments, capsular, extracapsular, all these ligaments will be found to be tense, which is the required state. It's not a bad thing, it's a very good thing. Yes, all the ligaments are going to be tense, and the articular surfaces are going to have what we call maximal congruence. To understand maximal congruence, it's quite simple. You must imagine that you want the surfaces of support to be maximal. You don't want of course, the part that is coming on the talus, the tibia, to be set at on a very small portion of the supporting surface. You want the maximum surface support so that you get maximum, in fact, dissipation of pressure. The more the surface in contact, the less the local pressure is going to be. It's like walking on snow with small shoes. You will go through the snow immediately because your weight is applied on a very small surface of the small shoes. And then you take skis, for example. Skis are just much longer and wider surfaces than the shoes, and because your weight is now applied on a very long and large surface, you're staying above the snow. If you suddenly take the skis out and try and walk, you're going to go through the snow. This is the same system. We have this idea that the more surfaces of contact we get, well, the better support. And science is, in fact, well, of course, showing that this is true. And so when that is the case, what Sarafian is saying, that the experience shows that the bones of the plantar skeleton become inseparable by traction in the position of maximal supination, which means that you cannot collapse the ankle or one side or the other. You cannot collapse the leg above the foot on one way or the other. You really get a supporting mechanism of high resilience. All that is needed is a correct coordination of the movements of the different parts. And that is not a given. You are endowed with ankles and knees, but there is no way to imagine that you are equipped with reflexes that are going to make the conditions, well, the coordination of the movement such that it will work, automatically, correctly. No. If you look around, if you look at the feet of people of my age, 60 or even earlier, already you look at people feet at like 20 or 30 years, and you look at the feet and you will think, wow, they are deformed. They are not used to the position of mechanical advantage. They are not used to, of course, this close back position that Sarafian is talking about. So then, if you want to help a person with incorrect use of the coordination of the movement of the ankle, then you are faced with the process of creating coordination. Very simple. You need to teach the person some rules of movements. You want the person to understand that the person will have to first be helped to analyze the different parts that are moving, and through this analysis start to get some rules of movements. I want these movements to happen continually at the same time, yes, so in such a way that they produce the position of mechanical advantage. On a very small subject of the whole structure, which is only the foot, you start to think, okay, yes, it makes sense. So coming back to Alexander's sentence, when we look at this, we have one psychological factor provides a position of rigidity by means of which the moving parts are held to the mode in which their function is carried on. Well, I started to think, well, this seems to make sense. We want a position of rigidity. a position which will maintain the structure against load. The more the person is going back in space, the more the load increases to deform the torso. The torso is made of moving parts. When you go against gravity, you will find that suddenly gravity wants to deform the load. How do you get, well, to hold the moving part in their function of support? Well, you have to create a coordination. Yes? And so we arrive at this idea that what is the psychological factor, the psychophysical factor, which provides a position of rigidity? Well, as I said in my book, we have to start thinking about the different movements of the parts that are going to, in fact, stretch the ligament and fascia and provide the position of rigidity by which the joint are held into the conditions that is the proper condition of work. We have to protect the joints. We cannot do any of the movement as we like them, as we feel them. We have to study and start to realize that the joints have ranges of movement. The other day, I was asked by a teacher, and the teacher said, what do you think of people who have hyperlaxity? Can they benefit from your lessons, from the initial Alexander technique lessons? Well, I said, well, in case of laxity, it's even more indicated to start to learn the rules of movement that should be applied to joints. We must understand that, for example, the spine is a joint and that there are rules that are rules, of course, of movements of the different parts that will create the position of mechanical advantage. If you want, I can call it the position of rigidity. The moving parts are to be held into a certain mold. That is what we see here. If you have laxity, this is even more necessary, because there is something with ligaments. Is the problem of immobilization. So the problem of immobilization, you don't have to have a plaster, for example, to talk about immobilization. No, let's imagine that you ask a person to lie down every time if she feels like. That you tell the person that lying down is fantastic, that lying down is the solution for obtaining the correct position of the mechanism of the torso, neck, and head, let's say. Yeah, it's certainly not what I'm doing. I am just criticizing these images. So there is a very, very grave situation here, is that ligament functioning depends on strain stimulus. A strain is a stretch, but under load. Remember, there was all this conversation about mechanical advantage where I explained that it's not sufficient. For example, for the feet, it's absolutely obvious. For the back, it's the same. If you really want to obtain the result you want, first, you must understand that you have to promote movements under load. When you're lying down, you cannot. You may think of movements if you want, but you're not moving, and you're not making any decision regarding movements. And when you are going to be stimulated and standing upright, anything you've done in lying down is going to be completely null and forgotten, and impossible to use. I give lessons to people that have been lying down semi-supine for 20 or 30 years. You should see their backs. You should see their capacity to resist to leaning back, for example. It's appalling. So why is that? Well, it's because, so we are talking animals because that's the Wren paper is talking about animals, but we are a certain kind of animal. I'm placing something high to say that it's like a superior animal in some ways. Yes, in mature animals, immobilization causes a drastic decrease in the loading. That's obvious. And consequently, the strain stimulus experienced by a tendon or ligament. The reduced strain stimulus leads to a rapid loss of cross-sectional area, modulus, and strength. What does that mean? Well, that means that the ligament is going to get weaker because it's going to get smaller. The cross-sectional area is the if you see of an elastic and you look at the cross-sectional area, if you cut the elastic in two, you look how dense, how large the elastic is. It's obvious that the larger, the denser, the more it's going to resist. Well, in this case, it's not the case. What we call modulus, the rapid loss of modulus of an elastic means that you can have an elastic that is resisting a lot and an elastic that resists very little, despite the fact that both elastics, after you stop pulling on it, will come back to its original form. Well, the modulus is the capacity of resistance of an elastic band. Yes? And of course, the strength. So now, the good news is that when loading is restored through remobilization, of course, remobilization with an increase in loading, it's absolutely important to explain that we need loading. Then the strain stimulus is elevated and the properties rapidly recover as the immobilization effects are reversed. Exercise can also increase the strain stimulus, leading to increases in the geometric and material properties. Similar changes occur in immature animal, and the difference between immature and mature animal can be attributed to the baseline biological growth that occur independently from mechanical loading. Well, that just explained that with very young animals, there is a second aspect, is that growth is responsible for the increase in the strength and dimensions of the ligaments. But we are, most of us, mature animals, and for most of us, what's going to be important is mechanical loading. And you must understand, therefore, that mechanical loading has a good side and a bad side. If you have mechanical loading and a wrong organization of movements of the parts, then you will have some parts of the ligaments that are going to be unduly stretched, and the others on the other side that are being underused. And the danger is coming from the underuse. So what is absolutely fundamental is rules of coordinations of movements. So that, yes, exercise can do some benefit, but for people with laxity, exercise is a dire prospect, because if they have hyperlaxity, it means that their understanding of the functioning of the joint is not really accurate, and that obviously they have the instability has been increased by the incorrect coordination of the movement of the whole. So for people with increased instability of the joints, is even more necessary to have lessons of conscious guidance and control. So this is the first part of my analysis of the doctrines of antagonistic action and mechanical advantage. Any more? Any questions or comments?
My main questions are about further down in the quote, but I think you're going to be talking about that the next time. Anyway, what does Alexander mean when what does he mean when he says one psychophysical factor?
Oh, it's at first it's simple. A rule is a psychophysical factor, a rule of movement. A rule of movement, so you understand that a rule is something that is psychological. A rule is speech. A rule is theory. There is nothing physical in a rule. Yeah, you observe something and you think, yeah, for these two parts to move correctly together, one should be rotating one way, the other way. Okay, it's a rule. But why is it psychophysical? Well, it's psychophysical as soon as you try to apply the rule to yourself. And you got the intention of the two movements and you apply it and you watch on video whether you're applying it or not. So the psychophysical factor is already the process of translating an intention or a series of intentions of movements into a coordination that's going to be seen on video and checked on video. It's very simple. I ask a person to stand on one leg. Okay? It's an equilibrium procedure. Immediately you're asked to stand on one leg, your equilibrium is stimulated. And so you're going to react. And we see at first, when you're asked to stand on one leg, we see at first that you produce exactly the defect Alexander is talking about this positioning of the ankle. Then you're going to be explained the procedure of coordination, how to organize the load of the torso onto the ankle when you're going onto one foot only. And we see whether you're able to translate the rule into practice. As soon as you are, and you will see it's not a big difficulty, we are discussing a psychophysical action. It's not an action that is intellectual. You're not just doing something in your mind. Of course, you're talking in your mind, you're trying to guide your movement, but also you're practically performing something that is completely different to your habitual way of reacting to the same stimulus. That's my point. That's what I think Alexander is discussing when he's talking about the psychophysical factor. I don't know, many other students of the technique, other teachers may have different ideas. I'm ready to hear them.
Okay, so anyone who would like to comment, please either leave a comment under the video or get in touch with Jeando. You will see there's a link underneath. So if you want to book a lesson with him or you have a comment or anything you'd like to discuss, we will see you in the next video. Thanks, Jeando.
Oh, may I make a last statement, please?
Sure.
There are some people that are requesting that I discuss some points or another. This is the case, for example. This was a question asked by a teacher. You must understand that we make these interviews nearly every week, and that processing the video is, of course, Kevin's job, and it takes quite a long time. So we are the videos that you see have been done in the past, and so when you request something, you must understand that you cannot have the video the next week. It's impossible because of the lag. So we are going to try and respond to the queries as much as we can, but you must accept that there are going to be a delay. That's all. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Bye-bye.